So welcome to this Hague Mothers podcast, Teaching the Hague and Inspiring Activists. Today I'm talking to two members of our fabulous UK steering group about their experiences of teaching students about the Hague Abduction Convention. It's a model that we hope will be taken up by other universities in the UK and beyond. And so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sonja Carlson and Kim Fawcett.
Pleased to meet you.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for having us.
A pleasure. Thanks to both of you for being part of the Hague Mothers Project and for sharing your expertise with us today. So a really brief introduction. Sonja lectures at University College London in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. This covers a huge range of topics from the mental health impacts of humanitarian disasters to gender-based violence. She also leads the mental health work of the Lancet Countdown. And Kim is a teaching fellow in criminal law at Durham University and also co-director of the Durham Gender and Law Research Centre. Her research interests include the Hague Abduction Convention and its impact on mothers fleeing domestic violence. And they've both been involved in teaching students about the original intentions of the Hague and the injustices which now appear to be absolutely endemic to the process. So, can we have a little more about you, please? Could you tell us, in turn, a little bit more about your current research and teaching roles and what really interests you?
Thank you so much again for having us here. So as you mentioned, I work around based at UCL, and I come from a background in disaster risk, disaster studies, as well as migration, immobility, gender-based violence, and climate change, actually. So I've just a few months ago set up a research group at UCL, which is called Everyday Disasters and Violences. And we're looking very much at violences in our current societies and all around our neighborhoods. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about gender-based violence, we go to conflict, Africa, Asia, certain countries, and we try to distance ourselves from what's happening in our societies. So it's really about doing research on the levels of violences that we experience every day. So from that, I do quite different. I have different hats and portfolios, but everything is kind of coming out of the work that I've done on migration and on refugees, displacement, immobility, and trapped populations. So I've always worked on policy, but a lot of times it's been more related to protecting children and women in a policy context, and especially when it comes to disaster. I've spent a lot of time looking at cyclones, so disaster strikes and cyclones, and especially in terms of gender-based violence when it comes to women and children, so child sexual abuse or rapes during evacuations in cyclone shelters, and looking at the immobility of women in terms of deciding to not evacuate but stay back home instead of evacuating because they're so scared of getting raped or sexually assaulted or facing violence in the cyclone shelters or on the way to the shelters. And in that space, I looked a lot on immobility and trapped populations, and particularly migrants who end up trapped in, for example, when they move from one country to another country or within countries. And I realized that there is a great potential actually when it comes to the family courts and the Hague Convention in terms of women and children ending up legally entrapped in situations and in countries. So with the Shira Research Group, we've done some work looking at the family courts in England and Brazil in terms of mental health and health impacts of the family courts in the context of domestic abuse, domestic violence. And with Hague Mothers, as we know, we look at similar context, but in the context of the Hague Convention. So when women and children try to escape across borders and end up trapped or entrapped in countries and in situations of violence. So that's a long but very short still summary of my research portfolio.
That is so fascinating to think about that breadth of research, but with those threads of violence and immobility and being trapped running through it. It's absolutely amazing. And Kim?
Thanks for having me as well. It's an honour to speak to everybody about the Hague Convention and the links or the impact the Hague Convention has on victims of domestic abuse. So as Ruth said, I am a teaching fellow in criminal law at Durham University, and I also teach some family law as well. So my research areas link between family law and criminal law, really. And I'm a Hague mum myself. So around about 13 years ago, I was also Hagued, and it kind of set me off on this journey of wanting to find out more about the Hague Convention, because I had no idea that it existed at the time, and of wanting to help others who were going through a similar situation. So I went back to university and I got my law degree. And for my undergraduate dissertation, I wrote about the Hague Convention and women trapped because of domestic violence. And I realised in a 10,000-word dissertation, it was just not enough words. And I hadn't researched half as much as what I really wanted to research. So after I finished my undergrad, I was lucky enough to secure some funding to do my PhD. And my PhD focuses more in breadth about the Hague Convention and the impact that it has on women fleeing domestic abuse. I've been lucky enough to do some primary research, so I've interviewed 12 women about their experiences of fleeing domestic violence and their experience of the Hague Convention. And one of the things that I found the most shocking was how many women go on to lose custody of their children due to Hague cases, because they either lose custody battles afterwards because they're posed as an abduction risk to their children, or they don't have the correct immigration status when they return back to the country of the child's habitual residency. And some mothers end up not seeing their children for years and years and years. One woman hasn't seen her children for 7 years. So my PhD started to take more of that focus on how the Hague Convention is weaponized as another form of coercive and controlling behaviour, in that even though there isn't serious violence, as in physical violence, and unfortunately the mum can't raise Article 13b because there's no grave risk of harm to the child, what I'm noticing is that perpetrators of abuse, and including coercive and controlling behaviour, are using that as a tool to get mums back or to trap mums, and they're using their children almost as a pawn to get back at mum for having left in the first place. So that's what my research it focuses on, and I'd like to do a lot more in that area, especially trying to make people aware that coercive and controlling behaviour also poses a grave risk of harm to the child and to the mother, and therefore we shouldn't be returning these mums back to those situations.
I think we all very much agree on that one. Yes. Okay. Thanks, both of you. And fascinating. I don't think you knew each other before you both joined the Hague Mothers. But it's fascinating
no, we were brought together,
how much synergy there is in your work and in your approach and in your understanding of how mothers are trapped by this. So back to you, Sonja. So you're going to tell us a little bit about your teaching range, and then we can have a little chat about the module itself.
So I'll teach on undergraduate level, so students who are doing a bachelor at UCL, IRDR. And we'll have this bachelor, which is called, it's a program in humanitarian studies. And it's quite exciting. So it's one of the first humanitarian focused bachelors to start with. So a lot of the students, they come there and they want to either, they want to change, the world for the better and improve the situation, work with human rights, but from different levels. So many of them want to work with the UN, other wants to be diplomats, some wants to be, human rights lawyers, and others, they want to push policy. So it's a quite unique project in that sense. And then we're tapping into different areas that are, humanitarian, in humanitarian contexts and humanitarian disasters or situations that needs to be improved. So within that program, I lead 2 modules. The one that I'll focus on first is IRDR 0039. So write that down if you want to apply. And it's called Humanitarian Policy. And it's very much about understanding policy making and understanding how to change policy, like the whole kind of things that you don't get taught. because I think we all talk about, like, oh, policy pitching and, like the elevator pitch with the policymaker and so on. But I think a lot of people, they don't realize, all the kind of small tips and tricks that actually goes into delivering clear policy messages and, making a policymaker actually like understand what is the problem, why is this a problem, and what needs to change. So we're kind of taking the students, through that journey over 10 weeks, and we tap into different situations then that are on a humanitarian level. So it's very much about the UN conventions. And since, the Hague Convention is one of the areas that I feel very passionate about, and that I really think needs to change, I think very, very few people know anything about Hague Convention. I think most students actually, they kind of started that with thinking that, Hague Convention is great because, child abduction is terrible. And I've thought a lot about, the kind of words that we use, like, abductor, abduction, unlawful removal from a country, or, so it's all kind of framed around, doing something bad or committing a crime. So I think the students, they start that week thinking that, oh, this is going to be, about why abduction is a bad thing, and, how do we stop it, or how do we kind of protect and emphasize or make sure that, the convention works. And then they realize, the complexity in terms of, if you're a migrant mom, you have been, like Kim mentioned, kind of groomed and trapped and, taken from your home country to another country by a perpetrator. You have no support network service, you have no family members, no friends, you're isolated, you find yourself in a situation where you're facing domestic violence and abuse, and you cannot escape. What do you do if you need to protect the child? You go home. And just that, which is a human right, because it's a human right to return home, becomes a crime, and you become an abductor. So that's kind of the umbrella of that week.
That's an extraordinary aspect of The Hague, isn't it? That it turns innocent people and people who are victims of crime, in fact, into the perpetrators. It's truly Darvo-esque, yeah. And so, Kim, you were asked by Sonja to take part in this. So what were the aspects of The Hague that you felt were really important to bring over during the teaching?
So I was lucky enough to have Sonja ask me to be a guest lecturer at UCL to teach about the Hague Convention and the impact of domestic violence. And well, to me, the most important thing to teach the students was very much that what started out to be a really good law has turned really, really bad. So I knew that the students would be going in, as Sonja said, thinking that child abduction is a really bad thing, and the Hague Convention is really good because it brings back children to the status quo, and that is, that's positive. That's what we want to do as lawyers, as human rights activists. So what I tried to focus on was I tried to get the students to look at it from a different perspective. And I told them a story of a woman who had been trapped in an abusive relationship in another country, and her journey through, let's say, the abuse and how the abuse escalated until she had a child, and then her decision to leave. When the violence became so bad towards her and her child, she decided to leave. And then I said, she's left the country, she's come home, and I asked the students, is this something you think she's done right? Has she done the right thing? Mm-hmm. Of course, the students said, well, yes, of course she has. She's left domestic violence and she's gone home. And then I kind of threw this bomb at them and said, well, actually, she's now a criminal. She is an abductor, and therefore she will be served Hague papers and potentially return back home within a 6-week period. And you can see the students' faces and they go, really? How is that possible? And that's when I started, obviously, to teach them about, how the Hague Convention is now used as a weapon towards women who are fleeing domestic abuse, and focusing on the fact that we have 75% of abductions take place by women, and how the Hague Convention really is not fulfilling its original purpose to protect the child anymore. So we focused on that, and we talked about the potential defences, but how those defences simply aren't working for victims of domestic violence. And I was teaching them the reality of women who are losing their children, and women who are stuck in another country until the children turn 16 or 18, and that they have no support, that they are suffering from homelessness, and some women even end up murdered, like Narkis. So we have to, I try to get them to think of it from that other perspective, and the students seem to be very shocked, but also very interested that this was happening in real life, that this was something that's happening in 2023.
So that's a great context to give them, and that understanding of the reality of it, as opposed to the sort of the dry legal aspects. And you mentioned the defences as well. How much did you teach the students about those dry legal aspects, about how the convention came into being, etc.? Or was it very much that you took that sort of humanitarian, emotional, person-centered approach? And that's a question to both of us, really.
Yeah, from my perspective, so obviously my law students at Durham, I do go through the law in a little bit more depth, because they're law students and they are interested in how the law is applied. So it is slightly different when I'm teaching at Durham. But for UCL, I did give them a list of what the defences were. And I did basically tell them that Article 13B is the defence that most women will try to use, not to be returned, but that it wasn't, that defence wasn't really working. But I tried to focus it more on that humanitarian issue, on returning women to violence, on a human rights issue. Women can't go home, women are trapped, women are suffering from homelessness and poverty, and they're being returned to torture, because that is essentially what it is. It's torture. Sending somebody back to violence is sending them back to torture. So I took a much more humanitarian approach, a much more personal approach, I would say, when I was teaching it at UCL. Don't know if you agree, Sonja, but that seemed to be more the approach I wanted to take with those students.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think that was what we did. I think maybe one thing that is important to keep in mind was that, so they did actually work on like policy projects throughout these 10 weeks. So they already picked the topics then early on in the beginning of the module. And we had 2 groups working specifically on the Hague Convention with about 6 students. And one group took the approach from, a kind of child perspective, as in like looking at the problematics and the context from a child's perspective. And the other group looked at the Hague Convention and the same kind of complexity, but from a mother's perspective. So that was also very interesting to see how those, 2 then policy briefs in the end came together. So, of course, they had a good reading list, like, a lot of the ones that we have up on our Hague Mother website as well, like you could and you should, or you can and you should, in terms of, that actually judges, they should probably use the 13B defense mechanism more often that they do. So, and they do study, so they do have a few law modules. So it wasn't that they were completely, detached from law. So they study, for example, humanitarian law. We have a human rights lawyer who does those modules, and also migration law. So they kind of understand some of the dynamics in terms of, movements and rights for someone who then move across borders, either as a migrant or, in a refugee situation and context, and also linked to conflict and violence a little bit. So they had that background. I must say that when the policy brief came together, and also when Kim had a look at them, we both went like, wow. They exceeded our expectations, I think, tremendously. I mean, I'm not going to call out names, but I've seen a lot of policy briefs, through my days in the UN, and I've seen a lot of really bad ones actually put together by, UN staff and people who've worked on policy for decades. So to have bachelor students coming in and being able to have so targeted recommendations and setting out the problem with statistics, charts and tables, and and recommendations in terms of like, for example, questions that some of the people working on the family courts, for example, in England and Wales, have been talking about for 10-15 years. Like, is Kafka's really child-centered? Like, why isn't the child's voice emphasized? If you have a 13-year-old child who decides that no, actually this is what I want, like, why is their voice not good enough in terms of what they want to do in court and so on? So they were very good, and one of them is now published on the Hague Mother website, together with a blog where the students talk a little bit about their experience from the module, and what of kind of great like learning development that was. And I have a feeling that some of them will go on and they will either become like lawyers working on the Hague Convention, or policymakers trying to change the Hague Convention and how it's being implemented. And I feel like that is the aim, isn't it? Like, we need to make sure that all this amazing young generation that are coming and taking over when we're old enough and we can't do this work anymore actually go on and they make the change that we may not be able to do during our careers and lifetime.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The enthusiasm and the sense that the students were absolutely involved and really cared about this absolutely comes through in that piece of work that's up on our website. Did you find the same thing, Kim, with the student response? And was it unexpected, or?
Yeah, so in Durham, I am module leader on a module that's called Law, Gender and Society. So obviously very gender focused, as the name suggests, and I taught the Hague Convention from a gendered perspective, and very much did what I did with Sonja's students at UCL. It gave them that humanitarian perspective, but we went through the law as well. And what I found, the students were shocked. That's the one thing I can say, that students were shocked. And the amount of emails that I received afterwards asking, how can I help? What can I do? What charity can I volunteer for? How can I get into this as a career? Because the Law, Gender and Society module is for our second years. So they still have time to be able to decide what their career paths may or may not look like. And I asked them as well to write a policy brief, and they could choose between 2 subjects, and 6 chose another subject and 70 chose the Hague Convention. So it kind of shows that this was something that the students really impacted on them. They really found it interesting, shocking, and they obviously thought that this was something that needed to be changed. So yeah, we have a small group here of students where we have this opportunity to be able to push them to change things for the future. As Sonja says, we have up and coming lawyers, up and coming barristers, policymakers, politicians perhaps, who now have this under their belts. No, actually, this is really unfair in this day and age. And this is something that I hope a lot of our students will end up taking forward. I always say to them, I'm going to see you one day when I'm 65 on the news because you've changed the Hague Convention. And that's what, I think that's what our aim always is with the students. At the moment, I'm marking through all of the policy briefs. And yeah, some of them are absolutely excellent, Sonja, as well. I mean, they're really good, better than some I've seen I think they could hold some people up to shame.
So what's next then? I mean, clearly you've been even more energized through working together on this, and we'll take those things back to Durham, I'm sure, Kim. But what's your hope for the next stage?
Well, we have a few things that I think I'm really hoping that some of the students will go on to either, the ones in this cohort and in the bachelor to do their dissertations on the Hague Conventions and on the context, and then hopefully, go on and follow in Kim's steps, and do a master and then a PhD as well. But immediately, I think Kim and I have been discussing that it would be really nice to work with some of the students and write a paper. So it could be even, a desk study more, or, you know, look at some of the empirical data that we have, because it's probably a little bit too big unless, you know, we go for a project, which is, you know, something that we also want to do longer term. But the students, at least the bachelor, they're not going to be with us for that long. I also have a year 3 module, which is called IRDR 0048. I've memorized them. And it's on violence, intersectionality, and marginalization. And it's taken a bit of a different approach, where it's about visual communication analysis and the kind of understanding of how the reproduction of certain images and visual kind of representation of marginalized groups work in, you know, against people. So just like going back to what I said before, like what is the visual kind of image that comes to mind when we say child abduction, or when we say, you know, abductor, and so on. So I think a lot of those images, they work against Hague mothers, and they work against migrant mothers. And, you know, putting it in the context, it's also in some of the situations with these mothers, the fathers are not involved. You know, the perpetrator may have left, but he remains, like in England and Wales, with parental responsibility. So he may have been absent for you know, maybe 5 years or so. And then the mother decides to go back to her home country because, like we said before, she doesn't have friends. She doesn't have a reason to be in that country anymore. And the father finds out and decides to launch, you know, a Hague proceeding against the mother. And legally, they can do that, because in England and Wales, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to change parental responsibility. It never happens. So we have all these mothers and children who are in a very vulnerable context. So the aim of this module is, and of course, this is something that is being designed at the moment, so it's not completely together, but similarly to the 39 module or humanitarian policy, it will tap into these different scenarios. And I would really, really want Hague Mothers and the Hague Convention to also have a week on that module when we think a little bit around both like mother blaming, but also the perspective of, you know, migrant mothers, because I think that's something we don't really talk about. Even when we look at family law and the family courts and domestic violence, domestic abuse, you know, the kind of intersectionality of migrants, or, you know, a poor migrant mom is sometimes, you know, it kind of falls between the shares. And when we talk about England and Wales, a lot of people think about, okay, so this is a British mom with a British child, but a lot of times it's not. So that's something that I would hope to incorporate into that module. And of course, again, I'll reach out to Hague Mothers, maybe even wider. I was thinking for this module to actually do it even more people-centered and you know, life experience. So I really want the students to understand the kind of, you know, real life scenario of a Hague mom, because with the policy, of course, module, we had to focus more on, you know, what is the problem in terms of the convention, and how do, you know, how can we change policy? But here I really want to focus in terms of why are Hague mothers or migrant mothers being marginalized, and how is the Hague Convention actually working as structural violence every day against these mothers, and how can we change those images, and what kind of intersectional roles makes a mother and child more vulnerable to that structural violence.
Wow. I would love to be your student on that module. And what about you, Kim? I mean, I know you've been teaching in Durham, teaching about the Hague Convention in Durham for a while. Have you got more ambitions for ways in which you could extend that?
Well, yeah, I think that this is the advantage of being in the early stages of as an early career researcher. I've got a lot of ideas, I suppose. It's been great meeting Sonja, because I think that together we can actually start publishing some papers, writing some policy briefs, hopefully getting some funding. I would like to see in the longer term a larger study done to look at statistics and data to how big this problem is, because our latest statistical data is 2015. So things have changed a lot since then. It would be lovely at some point to get some funding secured to be able to have to do a big project like that. But of course that takes time, and we need, we've got to take those small steps first. Thinking about migrant women as well, one of the issues around migrant women is the Domestic Abuse Act that's just been brought into force in England and Wales. And one of the biggest issues that I think we also need to focus on at the moment is the fact that migrant women are not entitled to public funding. So if they want to leave an abusive relationship, they can't tap into any funding, they can't tap into the NHS, they can't tap into refuges that are state funded, etc. But then they can't go home either, because dad will, invoke the Hague. So these women, I think, that are extremely trapped. So I think there's definitely an area there for us to work on and to try to push forward, at least for government to start looking at that and thinking, well, what can we do to provide for these women? So yeah, that's the future. I am in talks at the moment. Hopefully, once my PhD is passed in the summer, I would like to publish it as a monograph as well, which would be great to be able to give to students for the future, and to help them with their modules. And yeah, as I move on, every place I go, I want to do a module on gender, law and gender. That is something I really want to push. If I move from Durham, I'd like to go somewhere else where they will consider doing law and gender. I think we really need to focus on how the law is impacting women at the moment, not only with the Hague Convention, but the family courts, domestic violence, migrant women. It's a module that needs to be taught. And I would like to see the Hague Convention taught on the family law modules as well, which at the moment, most universities don't teach it. They teach family law here in England and Wales, but they don't touch on that women can't move from this country without permission of the father. And I think that's something that we can also tap into to make students more aware of what's happening internationally as well.
You two are so inspiring. Yes, every conversation I have with you, I'm left feeling full of joy in spite of the awfulness of the context that we're talking about. Okay, so can people contact you to find out more? Would that be okay? Yeah,
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
That's lovely. So when we put this podcast up, we'll also put a link to more information in the blog post. That's wonderful. So, is there anything finally you'd like to say?
There's one thing I'd like to say, actually, because I was thinking now about, have we covered everything that is important and like all the developments and that's happening? And that's like Kim's last sentence here was that, well, they can't leave the country without the permission of the dad or of the father or the court, right? And one very worrying trend that we're seeing now is that, if we just go back 5 years or maybe 10 years, if a mother would put in, a request or an application to relocate back to her country, most times if she was going, especially if she was going within Europe and, the child was going back to a situation where they would have a good school, they would have her family, friends, and a social support network. The mother would have a job and, a situation that was comfortable. It would be fine. It would not be an issue. Over a decade or so, we've seen and we've heard a lot about allegations around so-called parental alienation. And we also see that making its way into, the Hague proceedings, and actually just that request in terms of, I want to move, I want to relocate with my child, is a lot of time now being framed as so-called evidence of parental alienation. So I think that's really important to think about, and that's something that I really want to focus on in the papers. And I think those are some of the papers that Kim and I have discussed, that we really need to write those papers, because it leaves the mom, of course, without an option, because she can't get the permission of the father, and she's more and more likely not to get the permission from the court if it's seen like an act of so-called alienation. And then she ends up without a situation then to either stay in the country up until the child is 18 or, allowed to leave, or she goes with the child and becomes a Hague mom, so commits a crime according to the convention. Yeah,
absolutely. Parental alienation is it seems to be the big topic at the moment. If any mum says she wants to move, even within the country, if she wants to move to the other end of the country, if she says that there has been sexual violence, domestic violence, automatically the response now of the father is, it's parental alienation. And it's yet another hurdle that we're going to have to overcome when we try to push forward any changes in the Hague Convention. Because let's face it, nowadays we have so many options with technology to be able to keep in touch with the other parent. It's not an impossibility. We fly around the world without a bat of an eyelid. But this whole idea of parental alienation, I think, is going to hold us back unless we nip this in the bud right now and try to get people to see that the so-called parental alienation is a term that is very controversial, to say the least.
Yeah, so that is also something on the module. Actually, the students do spend a week first before they go into the Hague Convention, understanding, you know, well, what is parental alienation or so-called parental alienation? Where did it come from? How is it being used? Because I think that is the important point that we see a lot being debated now. There's been several articles in The Guardian around how it's being used as a counter allegation to domestic violence, abuse, child sexual abuse. So I think it's really important to keep that kind of in the background when you go into the Hague Convention and understand, you know, even, you know, that's, and the whole thing about, you know, asking, like as a grown-up, asking for permission to move, to me is interesting. You know, that a woman needs to ask for, you know, I need to ask for permission as an adult to move back to my country if I have a great job. Because it's, you know, so it's the permission of either, you know, the father or the court. So it's a very patriarchal system, which I suppose is spot on what Kim is saying, that, you know, we need to understand law and study law through like gender, through a gendered lens.
We have, and you do. That's what's so wonderful and remarkable. And that's what keeps me hopeful working in this arena, is working with people like you and the rest of the Hague team across the world who are, yes, committed to making this better. So thank you so much, both of you, for everything you do, for the module, for talking to us today, and yeah, and together we'll win. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.